They thought the courtroom would be their sanctuary, their weapon, their shield. But today the script flipped in a way no one saw coming because in a shocking move, the judge just denied sanctions and a protective order connected to the Blake Lively. Subpoenas that were quietly sent out to multiple creators, journalists, and even one former assistant, and suddenly all eyes are back on the targets. The ones Blake and her legal team hoped would stay silent forever, because those subpoenas were more than just legal tools. They were warnings, threats backed by silence. Now crumbling under scrutiny, and as the judge refused to grant protection to Blake's side, it sent a loud message. No more hiding, no more sealing. The pressure is mounting, not just on Blake, but on everyone involved in this smear plot that started it all, and what was meant to be a closed-door procedure has turned into a public reckoning with timelines, evidence, and motives now in full view. So buckle up, because what happens next isn't just a legal footnote, it's the unraveling of an empire built on pastel perfection and backroom power plays. They stood there, stunned, as the judge's voice cut through the courtroom with more weight than anyone expected. No dramatic gavel, no outburst, just a ruling that pulled the rug out from under Blake Lively's legal team because they had walked in with confidence. The kind of polished legal presence that assumes the court will agree that subpoenas to online creators and commentators were justified, that a protective order would shield them from deeper questioning, and that sanctions would muzzle anyone who dared speak up against it. But that all fell apart in seconds, the moment the judge said the words "motion." Denied. The room didn't erupt, but it changed the air, shifted. The expression on Blake's lawyer's face was the first crack in a strategy they had kept tight for months. And what this ruling meant wasn't just a procedural loss, it meant the people they targeted with those subpoenas now had a legal opening to fight back, to ask why, to demand clarity, and to expose what had really been going on behind the scenes. Because the subpoenas weren't just about gathering facts, they were about stopping speech, stopping speculation, stopping stories from growing louder. And now the court had made it clear it wouldn't be part of that suppression, not without a real reason, not without something solid. And what made this moment even more explosive was who those subpoena targets were. Not just faceless trolls or anonymous posters, but public names. Content creators, whistleblowers, people who had spent the last year under silent pressure, while Blake's team moved carefully through backdoor channels, trying to silence narratives before they could become headlines. And now those people had just been handed leverage, the chance to say, look, the court didn't back her, the court said no, and that changed everything. And it didn't stop there, because with the denial of the protective order, suddenly the entire legal strategy that was meant to shield sensitive communications, internal emails, and confidential timelines from ever seeing the light of day became vulnerable. And for a case that was supposed to move in the shadows, this denial was a spotlight, because now questions will flood in. Who exactly received the subpoenas? What did they contain? How far did they reach? And most importantly, what were they trying to cover up? Because rumors had been circulating that some of the subpoenas went to creators who had never even named Blake Lively, but had only commented broadly on the larger celebrity legal drama unfolding, and the idea that even commentary had triggered legal action sent shivers down the spine of the digital community. Creators suddenly realized this wasn't just a fight between Hollywood elites and rogue journalists. It was a fight for what could be said online, what could be questioned, what could be speculated. And the court's decision to deny sanctions signaled a massive turning point. And for the first time in this entire case, Blake and her team weren't ahead of the narrative. They were reacting, scrambling, pulling pieces back, in hoping to maintain some control over a story that was unraveling. And as details started emerging about the internal back and forth that led to the subpoenas, one thing became clear. This wasn't a spontaneous legal move. This was a deliberate campaign, months in the making, with curated targets and legal language that was designed not to win in court, but to scare off opposition, to send a message to those who might ask the wrong questions. And now that strategy was on full display, not because Blake wanted it to be, but because the court said no more secrecy. And you could see the panic starting, not in the form of screams or objections, but in the silent shuffling of papers, the rushed side whispers between attorneys, and the quick messages being sent out of the courtroom the moment it was over, because damage control had officially begun. And while Blake herself wasn't in the courtroom, her absence was louder than any statement her team could have made. She had chosen not to appear perhaps thinking this would be a routine ruling, a procedural win, something her lawyers would handle, but now her absence was being interpreted as something else. A retreat, a dodge, and with social media lighting up and creators who had been under pressure now speaking out, the tide was turning, and the fact that the judge had chosen to be so direct in the ruling made the message even more powerful, because this wasn't a vague denial, it was a precise legal rejection of tactics that many viewed as abusive and overreaching. And while the case itself is far from over, this moment shifted the power. It gave voice to those who had been silent, and it gave the public a rare window into how legal power can be used to chill speech, to scare dissent, and to try and control narratives. And now, the narrative was out of control, and as the court documents began circulating online with redacted names but unmistakable clues, people began connecting dots, connecting which creators had been quiet for months, which journalists had gone dark, which timelines suddenly didn't match, and it all painted a picture of coordination of a legal machine that had been rolling behind the scenes and now was breaking apart in front of everyone. Because with the court refusing to grant sanctions, Blake's team now had to deal with discovery. Not just their own arguments, but counter-arguments document requests and possible depositions, and one thing was certain, the people they went after weren't backing down anymore. In fact, they were already preparing their responses. Some already had lawyers lined up, some were teaming up to share legal resources, and others were talking to the media anonymously for now, but promising full stories once the seal was lifted. And every day the pressure increased, because the public was no longer distracted by gloss or celebrity. The public wanted answers. Why were these subpoenas filed? Who approved them? What was the actual purpose? And most damning of all, what did Blake's team know when they filed them? Because some insiders claimed that internal memos showed concern over blowback that they knew going after creators could spark a digital war, but they did it anyway. And now that war was starting. And it was being waged not with rumors, but with court documents, timestamps, and emails. And the digital creators who had been targeted, many of whom had small followings, were now front and center, and their stories weren't about fame or revenge, but about fear and intimidation. And now they had the judge's words as a shield. And it was only the beginning, because this ruling opened the door for more challenges, for new motions to dismiss, and for a potential wave of legal scrutiny to be directed back at the team that filed those subpoenas, because if any were filed improperly or without cause, it could backfire badly. And that's what made Blake's legal camp nervous, because suddenly they were being watched, not just by their peers, but by the very public they had tried to keep in the dark. And behind closed doors, other celebrities were watching too, because the implications went beyond this case. It sent a warning to anyone thinking about using their influence to silence critics, that the courts were not going to automatically play along. And for Blake Lively, whose image had always been curated to perfection, this legal moment was cracking that image, not with scandal, but with strategy. And as more voices emerged calling out what they described as legal overreach, her team found themselves facing a growing PR crisis, not from tabloids, but from lawyers, influencers, journalists, and now even former insiders who felt the line had been crossed. And all of it started with one simple ruling motion denied. As the second courtroom session opened that morning, the energy inside was completely different. The public gallery was packed wall to wall again. But now, instead of anticipation, it was tension that hung thick in the air, not the kind that comes with suspense, but the kind that arises when everyone knows something massive is about to drop. And this time, it was not just about Blake Lively's team defending its desperate subpoenas. It was about what those subpoenas represented, and the accusations flying back from the creators and legal commentators who had been served without warning. The judge entered calm but clearly prepared, and without wasting any time, he addressed the motions on the table and the counter motions filed by the creators' legal counsel, which argued that the subpoenas were not only overly broad, but designed to intimidate and suppress speech, something the judge said he would not take lightly. And that was the first major turning point. He looked directly at Blake Lively's lead counsel and asked plainly whether their team understood the burden they had placed not only on the court, but on the private individuals they had targeted for information that, according to the filings, was neither relevant nor proportional. The courtroom went silent as the lawyer attempted to respond, but his voice wavered just slightly, as if he knew this moment was already spiraling out of control. Then the judge dropped what many later called the quote-unquote warning shot. He stated that while sanctions would not be issued at this time, the actions taken by the team bordered on what he called aggressive civil overreach, that if any further actions of that nature occurred, he would consider them abusive to the discovery process. That moment sent chills through the gallery. Even Blake, who was not present in the room but represented via her legal proxy, seemed to pull back publicly as social media immediately picked up the judge's tone. The real story, however, was what came next, because just when it seemed like the subpoena drama might deflate, the attorneys representing multiple independent creators stepped up and submitted new evidence that changed the entire direction of the hearing. Documents, communications, and metadata from emails that appeared to show coordinated timing in the subpoena filings. One creator's lawyer explained how the timeline of those subpoenas closely mirrored the release schedule of a series of YouTube videos critical of Blake Lively and her legal strategies. And while the team denied any correlation, the judge asked for a detailed submission to evaluate potential misuse of judicial resources. He emphasized that he was not accusing anyone, but added that the optics alone were damaging, and if any evidence of intent surfaced, it could trigger consequences beyond the courtroom, including public relations fallout and ethical review boards. As soon as that session broke, the media outside went into frenzy mode, and what had once been a fairly silent and sealed legal back and forth was now becoming a mainstream controversy. The news cycles jumped, and the creators began publishing careful but emotionally resonant videos outlining their perspective, and the hashtag subpoena drama started trending. The narrative was no longer about one side pressing for legal protection. It was about transparency, accountability, and the public asking, how far is too far when celebrities or their legal teams go after online voices? And that's when the entire conversation started evolving. What would happen in the next courtroom session was already being predicted, but few expected what the judge would bring up next. And that's where part 3 begins, when the court reconvened for the next round. Everyone expected a procedural continuation, but no one anticipated the sheer scale of what the judge would unleash as the gavel struck and silence returned. The judge looked toward the gallery, then slowly turned back to Blake Lively's legal counsel and calmly requested a clarification on one particular line from the previous session. The phrase "coordinated pattern of subpoena issuance," which had been mentioned in passing during creator testimony and filed as part of a supplementary memo. The judge requested a full explanation of why subpoenas were issued to smaller creators with limited audience sizes, while several high-profile channels who had released similarly critical videos received no legal outreach. That moment shifted the entire room's attention, and the defense hesitated, not because they didn't have an answer, but because the truth could unravel everything behind the scenes. The explanation offered was vague, stating they were following lead-generating content patterns. But the judge wasn't having it. He pressed further, asking if these decisions were influenced by social media managers, PR firms, or outside reputation consultants. And that question hit like a sledgehammer. It suggested something the legal world had quietly murmured about, but no one had openly stated, that maybe this wasn't about defamation or discovery at all. It was about silencing specific narratives that hit too close to home for Blake and Ryan. The courtroom murmured the moment that possibility was spoken, and before the judge could even continue, one of the creators' attorneys rose and requested to submit a sealed document to the bench. The judge approved. It took less than 2 minutes for that sealed file to be reviewed, and when he looked back up, he was visibly unsettled. The document reportedly contained internal communications from a digital reputation agency that had been working with a publicist linked to Lively's brand. The content showed recommendations to, quote, neutralize dissent through indirect legal channels, and that was it. The court had proof of a coordinated image control operation masquerading as a discovery motion in a defamation-adjacent case, and the judge's tone shifted entirely. What followed was a lecture, not just to the legal team, but to the record itself, about the use of judicial power in modern digital battles. He emphasized that while every party has a right to protect their image, the courts are not weapons, and the courtroom is not a PR battlefield. He then moved swiftly, and for the first time directly stated that any further subpoenas of this nature would require prior judicial review. With transparent reasoning and public docket placement, the fallout was immediate. Social media lit up with reactions, headlines blared, phrases like "Judge SLAMS," "backroom tactics," and "subpoena scheme" exposed. Even longtime allies of Lively in the media began to pull back, unsure how to defend what was beginning to look like a calculated strategy to exploit the legal system, and if that wasn't enough, one of the creators who had previously remained silent uploaded a tearful video describing how the legal pressure had affected their family, their channel, their mental health, and how they never imagined their commentary would lead to legal threats from someone they had once admired. That video went viral within hours, receiving over 5 million views and framing the entire saga in a deeply human light. This wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about power imbalance, fear, and the weaponization of silence. And that's what set the stage for what was coming next. Because, well, the judge had denied the sanctions and protective order. Something far more damning was now underway, and in part for the story escalates beyond what anyone could have predicted. The fallout from the judge's rebuke echoed beyond the courtroom walls as legal analysts flooded podcasts and primetime panels dissecting what they called one of the most brazen attempts at soft censorship in recent legal memory. And while Blake Lively's team remained silent in public corridors, rumors swirled behind the scenes that internal pressure was mounting from brand partners, endorsement firms, and even film studios that suddenly didn't want their names entangled with what was now being dubbed Subpoena-gate. And the real breaking point came not from a lawyer or judge, but from a leaked email that dropped on creator forums like a digital bomb. The email, allegedly from a legal assistant tied to Lively's counsel, included a forwarded chain where one executive casually referred to subpoena recipients as noise to eliminate, and in that moment, sympathy evaporated and the entire landscape shifted. This wasn't about misunderstanding or procedural overreach anymore. This was about strategy cloaked in litigation, weaponized silence, targeted erasure, and creators knew it. The leaked message quickly made its way to journalists, and before the day ended, 3 separate major outlets published exposés tracing the timeline of the subpoenas back to a week following a particular influencer's viral video about a 2016 incident involving Lively's team, an incident that until now had been largely ignored, and suddenly viewers were connecting dots that had been hiding in plain sight. The timeline matched too perfectly. The creators targeted weren't just random, they were all creators who had touched on that same 2016 event, and worse, some of them had shown documents in their content that had apparently never been made public, which raised new questions. How did they get those documents? Who leaked them? And more importantly, why was Lively's team trying so hard to shut them down as momentum turned? Public support for the subpoenaed creators ballooned. Fans of these channels started massive fundraisers. Several creators gained hundreds of thousands of subscribers overnight, and in one unprecedented move, 3 of them announced they had teamed up and were jointly filing a motion not only to have their subpoenas quashed, but to sanction Lively's team for malicious prosecution. The courtroom was now no longer a defense chamber, it had become an offensive front, and the judge had no choice but to listen. And on the day of the hearing, when all parties appeared again, the courthouse was swarmed with camera crews, protest signs, free speech slogans, and even celebrity influencers who once worked with Lively now silently showing up to support the other side. And what happened in that hearing changed everything. One of the creator lawyers stepped forward and submitted what he called the digital chain of control, a full forensic mapping of how the smear content was categorized, tracked, flagged, and flagged. Again by a private analytics firm hired through a shell LLC that was financially tied to a company with ties back to Lively's inner circle. And as the data spread across the courtroom screen like a crime board in a thriller film, the entire room froze, judges' staff included, because it proved what no one wanted to believe: the subpoenas weren't just legal tools, they were part of a larger attempt to drown out voices that disrupted a curated narrative. And the judge sat back quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then he said he would need time to deliberate on whether to escalate the matter to higher judicial review, which meant that now it wasn't just Lively's team on trial, it was the system that allowed this kind of backdoor influence. And as the session adjourned, social media again exploded. The narrative had officially flipped, creators weren't. And just when the dust seemed to settle and the legal noise threatened to dissolve into another Hollywood memory, the court's final ruling arrived not as a whimper, but as a seismic shift that rippled through both the justice system and the influencer world. Because in a historic move, Judge Marshall issued a final summary judgment that not only denied the sanctions, protective orders, but also ruled that certain subpoenas were issued in bad faith with the intention to harass, silence, and intimidate public critics of a public figure, and the language was unmistakable, scathing in its precision and directed squarely at the legal team representing Blake Lively. And while her name was never stated explicitly in the judgment, the implication was thunderous, and everyone heard it. The media, the fans, the lawyers, the influencers, the brands, even the agencies that had once scrambled to defend her, now quietly adjusted their social media bios and swept away mentions. And in a matter of hours, the internet erupted, because this wasn't just about legality anymore. This was about principle. This was about the clear line that had finally been drawn between celebrity control and creator independence. And suddenly the phrase creator protection act trended #1 on every platform. A movement had formed, and it wasn't driven by spite. It was driven by survival, by justice, by the very need for people to tell stories without fear. And as all of this unfolded, Blake Lively remained silent. No press release, no denial, no staged paparazzi walks with rehearsed smiles and oversized sunglasses. Just silence. And in that silence, the world filled in the blanks, and what once was interpreted as grace now read like avoidance. What once was seen as elegance now looked like strategic retreat, and the creators who had been targeted, defamed, sent threats, given ultimatums, now stood together in the very courthouse that had once intimidated them, holding the very subpoenas they were supposed to be silenced by, and turning them into evidence of their power. And the judge, in his final words, said it best when he declared, "This court recognizes the vital role public discourse plays in our society, and that includes criticism, commentary, and yes, even conflict. But what it cannot and will not allow is the weaponization of the legal system to suppress voices that merely speak their truth." And in that single sentence, everything changed, because the message was clear. Blake Lively may have the fame, the face, the fashion, and the fortune, but in this courtroom, in this moment, in this era, truth spoke louder. And as the courthouse emptied and the city returned to its usual rhythm, one couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The wind was sharper, the skies a little clearer, and for every creator who had ever second-guessed uploading a video out of fear for legal consequences, they now knew something unshakable. No, they were not alone, and they never had been, because the tide had turned, the game had changed, and the era where silence was bought and lawsuits were threats was officially over. And as for Blake, the story wasn't over, but the silence she used to control the world now controlled her, and the people she once tried to erase had become the very reason her name would never be whispered the same way again.